Joe Biden is being branded as spineless for not pushing forward with sanctions against Russia's Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline to Germany. But the most vocal criticism was from Republican Senator Ted Cruz.
This calamitous foreign policy disaster is Joe Biden's fault. This is the direct consequence of Joe Biden's surrender to Vladimir Putin on Nord Stream 2.
That tirade came as the draft U.S. defense budget for next year moved up to the Senate. A number of anti-Russian measures were dropped in the House. In its previous form, the bill included a ban on Americans buying Russian debt and sanctions on Nord Stream 2. The Senate will vote on the defense budget next week. And RT America host Ben Swann says the removal of sanctions from the bill basically means that's because the American president doesn't want them there.
It's a fairly big deal. Consider the fact that obviously when the House version was written, as you mentioned, these sanctions were included. The Senate version, they're not included. That's something called reconciliation, where essentially the bill has to match. And so it looks like those sanctions won't be there, which means that the Biden administration is actually cutting ties with a lot of the rhetoric of the Democratic Party right now in the U.S., which is insistent upon having these kinds of sanctions built into these U.S. defense spending bills. And it's pretty significant for a couple of reasons. One is because the president himself has been indicating for some time that he does not want to continue to push forward on sanctions, specifically over Nord Stream 2, because of pressure he's getting from Germany. The Germans don't like this idea. Remember, this is not a unilateral measure on the Russians' part. Russia and Germany together are saying we want the pipeline. Russia says we want to send oil and natural gas to that pipeline. Germany says we desperately need oil and natural gas to that pipeline. But it does, as you know, all go back to this issue of Ukraine. The idea is that by Russia bypassing Ukraine, that somehow this will be harmful to Ukraine, or they'll be able to have greater leverage over Ukraine. And so the rhetoric doesn't necessarily match the reality. And again, you have two sovereign nations insisting that this is something they both want and both need. And I think the U.S. is finally backing away from this idea that they now recognize they can't stop it from happening.
Well, it comes after the Russian and U.S. leaders held these crisis talks as tensions over Ukraine continue to mount. Also, some people are pretty exasperated about NATO expansion along Russia's borders, too. And after some initial pleasantries, Biden apparently ramped up talk of sanctions against Russia in the event of a war with Ukraine. And since that time, U.S. officials have seemingly been proposing, well, nearly any idea that comes to mind. Have a look at this.
I would not rule out American troops on the ground. We don't rule out first-use nuclear action.
Some pretty worrying words said right there, but with more details on the official U.S. position and how the meeting went down stateside, here's our New York correspondent, Caleb Moppin.
Here's what we heard from the Biden administration. They talked about how Biden raised concerns about the buildup of Russian forces near the border with Ukraine, and from there talked about how the United States and its allies would respond with decisive economic and other measures if there was a military escalation. Now, Biden called on Putin to de-escalate and to return to diplomacy, and he instructed the respective teams to continue dialogue on Ukraine. At the same time, we did hear from the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan.
We still do not believe that President Putin has made a decision. What President Biden did today was lay out very clearly the consequences if he chooses to move.
That, seems to fly in the face of some remarks that we've heard from other U.S. officials. There are new sanctions to be imposed on Russia that are currently in the works.
These are not run-of-the-mill sanctions. What is being discussed is at the maximum end of the spectrum, or as I have called it, the mother of all sanctions.
So there seemed to be a desire on everyone's part for today's meeting to result in a de-escalation. However, this hasn't stopped the United States from talking of these new sanctions, and it hasn't stopped U.S. media from playing up this idea that there is somehow a Russian threat or Russian aggression. So quite an interesting day. We're waiting for more information from both sides about what went on in the meeting between the two leaders.
The threat of giving sanctions is a threat to say, if you move into Ukraine, will harm you, knowing that if Russia moves into Ukraine, the U.S., there isn't much they can do besides sanctions. But at the same time, I don't think that Putin wants to move into Ukraine. He's also at his own in his own side sending a message. There was a diplomatic agreement that NATO would not go further east. And normally in foreign policy, diplomatic agreements are respected. And in this case, several of the actors in the United States pretend this agreement never existed, which in my own research with Europeans, every single European actually confirmed it was there. So at this point, Putin does not trust the world anymore. He wants a legal commitment, and he's right in asking it, to be very frank.
Well, sanctions do remain a central tool of U.S. foreign policy, with U.S. Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs Victoria Nuland once again raising her head and once again threatening Russia.
What we are talking about would amount to essentially isolating Russia completely from the global financial system, with all of the fallout that that would entail for Russian business, for the Russian people, for their ability to work and travel and trade.
Well, Washington's also just rubbed China up the wrong way by imposing a diplomatic boycott on the upcoming Winter Olympics. It's also just imposed penalties on 14 officials and 4 entities in Iran, and in Syria over alleged rights abuses. Well, we discussed the role and impact of sanctions with a panel of guests.
Essentially, you've got a view in Washington that it's the U.S., it's American exceptionalism and supremacy, and they're doing whatever they can to, it's a very arrogant and aggressive policy, the use of sanctions, and it really is a means to destabilize other countries, sovereign nations. It creates economic hardships.
Earl, why do you think America is threatening to sanction Russia for something that A, has not happened, and B, will not happen according to the Kremlin?
Well, I think in one way it's a political move on that side. The other part is, hey, we need a boogeyman, and I think partially we're losing our influence, and it's kind of like a rabid dog, You start to lash out in different ways, trying to project yourself, and the only foreign policy we have is a sanctioned foreign policy.
It's this kind of destructive approach to international relations, but it's just so silly, because ultimately you're sawing off the branch you are sitting on. How do you think the continental United States is going to survive if it makes a devastated mess of the rest of the world?
Do you think any Western power seriously believes Russia is about to invade Ukraine? It's hard to understand the logic. What could Moscow stand to gain from starting a war?
Well, I think that the Western governments do well know that this is rather a blame game. They make the public believe that Russia is a real threat to the Ukraine at the moment. Russia is really in defense because they have to fear that Ukraine will become a part of the NATO alliance, and this is of course a major threat to the geopolitical setting of Russia.
Cutting Russia off from SWIFT would be the most extreme of measures deployed yet. It happened to Iran, devastated the economy there. Is there any chance of Washington pursuing what's being called a nuclear option?
Based on their questionable diplomats, they potentially could. I would think it'd be a very unwise move. Very little impact, I think, internally. Externally, it would kind of backfire. I would think Europeans would be very strongly lobbying against such of an action.
And if you're going to set off to do something like that, presumably that's the goal, well, that's just like opening a black hole up under the international banking system. We've seen what's happening in China with Evergrande wobbling and the property market there possibly going down the drain. And of course, if that happens, that's going to pull down the Western banking system potentially.
During